Member from Calgary-Hays.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to respond to the requirement of Government Motion 16, which accepts the January 4th, 2017 report of the Ethics Commissioner and upholds both her ruling and her proposed sanctions for words I spoke in this House on November 22nd, 2016. Mr. Speaker, I have no choice but to accept that Government Motion 16 has passed, and I am required to apologize to the Assembly. I must say, Mr. Speaker, if I thought at any point at the time that I said it that it was wrong, I certainly would not have said those words. Mr. Speaker, subsequently I retained independent counsel to find out what indeed I had done wrong and have had sought to have this matter adjudicated to the Court of Queen's Bench. In a preliminary hearing held recently in Calgary, a judge in that court found my complaint to be such that the judge ordered a hearing on the matter, which is scheduled for January of 2018. Mr. Speaker, I can only guess that if my complaint had not been worthy of a hearing, that I wouldn't be getting one, and I would have accepted that judgment knowing that I had indeed said something offside in this House. But the judge did not throw my complaint out, and we await a decision on whether my privilege as a member of this Legislative Assembly, and by extension, the privilege of every member of this Legislative Assembly to speak freely on the floor of this House, is subordinate to the Conflict of Interest Act. An interesting question indeed, and one that not only impacts members of this Assembly, but elected members of assemblies and parliaments across Canada and the Commonwealth. I regret that it has come to this, where a sitting government would attempt to limit the privilege of an opposition member to speak freely in the Assembly. As my colleague, the member of Calgary-Hays, pointed out, in Beauchesne Section 75 states that the privilege of freedom of speech is both the least questioned and most fundamental right of the member of Parliament on the floor of the House and in the committee.
Agreed.
It appears, Mr. Speaker, this may not be the case in Calgary any longer. And that really is an affront to this democratic institution and, in my opinion, to democracy itself. The fact that I'm being censured for raising an issue of importance not only to my constituents, but to all Albertans, is deeply concerning. And all because the government could not handle answering tough questions on their own policies. So, Mr. Speaker, it is sad. It is sad that the Premier can no longer do her job and have any involvement in upcoming labour negotiations with the public sector because her husband...
Honourable member, I do hope you keep your conversation related to the point of privilege matter.
It can no longer do her job and have any involvement. Would you like me to start again, Mr. Speaker?
No, I would like you to deal with the matter of privilege and speak to the motion.
I believe that I'm required to do this, Mr. Speaker, and I'm fulfilling the requirements. Mr. Speaker, it is sad. It is sad that the Premier can no longer do her job and have any involvement in upcoming labour negotiations with the public sector because her husband earns his living as a union executive. It is sad that the Minister of Justice and Solicitor General will have to resign her position because her husband is a police officer with the Calgary Police Service. Because given the Ethics Commissioner's ruling, how could she not be in conflict by making decisions that directly impact the Calgary Police Service, the one that employs her husband?
Great.
If the occupations and ways in which our spouses earn their living bears directly on what we as members can say in this House, it surely comes to bear on the work of ministers of the Crown.
Honourable member, do you have any closing arguments with respect to the action that has been approved by this Assembly?
I am delivering them right now, Mr. Speaker.
No, you're using it as an opportunity, honourable member, to speak to other members of this Assembly and not to the substance of the matter before us today. So if that's what you choose to continue, if that's what you continue to do, I'm fearful that I'm going to need to rule you out of order, speaking reference to other members. So speak to the matter of the point of order, not to the other members of this legislature in your matters that you believe might have something to do with this. So please, do you have any other you'd like to speak to the motion as approved by the Assembly, other than those comments respected to other members of the Assembly?
I will continue, but only with your permission, Mr. Speaker.
If you have words with respect to the motion approved by the Assembly, then absolutely. But if you are continuing to make references to other individuals of this House and their family members,
and yet they could before.
Honourable member, could you abide my request and speak to if you have something that you'd like to say with respect to the motion approved by the Council, the Assembly, with respect to your actions? Please proceed. I would ask that you stick to that subject matter, though, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All of my words have been about the ruling, and all of my words from now on will continue to be about the ruling. If the occupations and ways in which our spouses earn their living bears directly on what we as members can say in this House, it surely comes to bear on the work ministers of the Crown do as well. They manage large portfolios and wield tremendous power. How can Albertans trust that they are not using it to further their interests and, by extension, their own interests if it has been decided that my wife's very small business precludes me from asking questions on a topic related to that industry? If it sounds ridiculous, Mr. Speaker, that's because it is. But sadly, that's where we find ourselves today. What a shame it is for the government to seek to limit my ability to do my job as the representative for Calgary-Hays and member of the Progressive Conservative Party. And in so doing, they also move to limit the ability of each member of the Assembly to do her or his job. The precedent they seek to set will also limit the ability of each and every elected representative in the Commonwealth to do their jobs.
Agreed.
How, Mr. Speaker, does this serve the public interest? How are these government members doing right by Albertans? Beyond this, Mr. Speaker, I'm also sorry that the government has seen fit, in this case, to appoint itself judge, jury, and executioner on a matter that is indeed before the courts.
Agreed.
As my colleague from Calgary-Hays also pointed out in his remarks, it is not our job to evaluate the scope of Section 3 of the Conflict of Interest Act, especially not when the very question is before the courts. The idea that this government would rather score a win today than wait for the judge's decision speaks to how much the political discourse in the province has devolved since the last election.
Right.
To be clear, partisanship has its place, but the extent to which this government has blurred the line between their role as government and their role as NDP MLAs is a real disappointment. In fact, if the previous government, Mr. Speaker, had even tried to pull this stunt, the NDP opposition would have been all over us for censorship and abuse of power.
Exactly.
And they would have been right in that case, Mr. Speaker. Because I take my job as the MLA for Calgary-Hays and Progressive Conservative member very seriously, I'm standing in this House today to meet my obligation as I am required to do. But it's also the government that owes an apology to all Albertans for attempting to subvert the efforts of opposition members to hold them accountable for their actions and policies. They owe an apology to the judiciary in our province for presuming to do the job of an independent and impartial court, and to every member of the Assembly and Parliament in the Commonwealth for attempting to set a precedent that could limit the most sacred of parliamentary privileges, that of freedom of speech, a precedent that could be used by other governments to limit opposition's ability to be effective. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I now make my official apology to this House. I am sorry for the words that I said.
Thank you, honourable member. Thank you. Orders of the day.
Public bills and orders.